Well, welcome back, Jimmy Buffett fans. Welcome back to my channel, All the Stories That I Can Tell. And I am picking up this new vlog episode from the location of my last time down here in Key West, the Chart Room Bar. Now, the title of this vlog is going to be, I Have Found Me a Home. And what we're going to do on this vlog is we're going to chronicle all the places, or let me back up, most of the places that Jimmy Buffett lived while he was down here in Key West, Florida. Basically from 1971 until the late 90s, circa 1998-ish. So we are starting here at the Chart Room Bar, and I think that it's very important that we establish once again the history of this bar and what it meant to Jimmy Buffett. So let's go back. Jimmy Buffett was living in Nashville, Tennessee. He was a writer for Billboard magazine, and that was not his favorite job in the whole world, but he did make a lot of really good connections. And one of the connections that he made while living down there was with the artist, musician, Jerry Jeff Walker. So he hit it off with Jerry Jeff Walker, and Jerry Jeff, who was an established musician at that point, had already had a hit single with Mr. Bojangles, took a liking to this young writer for Billboard magazine named Jimmy. Now, Jimmy was married at the time. His first wife, her name was Margie, and they were going through some hard times. And unfortunately, their marriage would not last a whole lot longer. So Jimmy had already cut one album at that time. It was Down to Earth, and it sold only a couple of hundred copies. After that, he cut a second album, which was called High Cumberland Jubilee, and the record company lost those tapes. So Jimmy was at a low point in his life professionally. Jimmy was at a low point in his life personally. So Jerry Jeff Walker, who's the one connection that Jimmy made from his time down there, worked with him to get a gig down in Miami at a location called The Flick, near the Miami University campus now. And that was a really, really big gig at the time. There was a lot of singer-songwriters were booked there, a lot of troubadour types. So he got a gig where he was booked to play down there. So Jerry Jeff and Jimmy drove down from Nashville down to Miami to prepare for that gig. Well, when Jimmy got down to Miami for that gig, he was advised that his gig was actually 2 weeks later than what was originally scheduled. Now, Jimmy knows that it was scheduled for that particular week, but he suspected that the owner of the Flick just didn't want him to play that particular week, so bumped him for 2 weeks. So now Jimmy had 2 weeks to sit around at Jerry Jeff Walker's place down there in the Miami, South Florida, Miami area, with basically nothing to do but working on Jerry Jeff's car, a 1947 Packard that they called the Flying Lady. So they did a lot of car repairs on that car, and eventually they got it fixed up to where it was running pretty good. And Jerry Jeff's girlfriend at the time, her name was Murphy, and her first name was actually Teresa, but everyone just called her Murphy. She was a Key West resident, and they had a few days to spare because Jimmy wouldn't be playing for a few days up at the Flick in Miami. And she said, hey, let's take Buffett to Key West. Now, Jimmy had never been further south than Isla Morada. So they loaded into Jerry Jeff's 1947 Packard, the Flying Lady, with Jerry Jeff, Murphy, Jimmy, and Murphy's young son. I believe he was 2 or 3 years old at the time. And they drove down to Key West, where they got here right before sunset. And they came, the first place that they came was this bar, the Chart Room Bar. And this is the first place that they brought him. And he walks in, and the bartender at the time was Tom Corcoran. Tom Corcoran is a writer now, longtime established writer and resident of Key West, famous in his own right. But he was the bartender here at the time in 1971. And he asked if anybody wanted a beer. He asked if Jimmy wanted a beer. And Jimmy gave kind of a sheepish look, like, I don't really have a whole lot of money type of thing. And at that point, Tom Corcoran said, hey, the first one is on me. and he gave Jimmy a Heineken beer, and that was the first beer that they had down here. So Jerry Jeff was already royalty down here in Key West, so he's down here with Murphy, with Jimmy, and they have that very first beer down here in Key West, Florida. And Murphy and Jerry Jeff said, you need to see sunset. And they took him, after they left here, out over to Mallory Square, and they watched the sunset for the very first time. And Jimmy has referenced that a number of times in live concerts when he's getting ready to play Tin Cup Chalice. And in that song, Tin Cup Chalice, he does reference that 1947 Packard and the ride down here with Jerry Jeff. But Jimmy Buffett left Nashville in 1971, escaping both personal and professional failures at the time, which he was really down about. Came across here, met the bartenders here. He has that first beer, he sees his first sunset, and he falls in love with Key West. And he knows that this is going to be the place for him. Now, he still has those dates to fulfill up in Miami at the Flick, and he knows that he has to leave in a day or so to go do that. But that first night in Key West, he is going out with Murphy, and he is going out with Jerry Jeff, and they are going to have a blast, and he is going to fall even more in love with Key West. And for the next 20 some odd years, Key West, Florida will be Jimmy Buffett's home. And we are going to take you now on many of the locations that Jimmy lived in Key West, and all of the great songs and great albums that came out of that. So stay tuned. Hit the subscribe, hit the like, hit the notification. So Jimmy was down here. He was at the chart room. Jerry Jeff and Murphy brought him down, got him that very first beer there at the chart room, took him to Mallory Square so he saw that sunset for the very first time, and Jimmy was hooked on Key West. It was his first time down here, and he was already getting the understanding that this is where he wanted to be. So after sunset, Jerry Jeff, Murphy, Jimmy, they went out on the town, and they went up and down Waddell Street, and according to Jimmy, they went to every single bar on Waddell Street. So they were pretty well cooked by the time the sun was coming up. But one of the things that Jerry, Jeff, and Murphy wanted to make sure that Jimmy experienced as well too was to come here to the Key West Cemetery. And here is where they came as the sun was coming up. So you don't hear much about sunrises in Key West, you hear about sunsets. But that very first day, chart room, sunset at Mallory Square, Waddell Street, before it was even called the Duval Crawl, Jimmy was doing it. And this is where they brought him as the sun came up on his very first day in Key West. And for Jimmy, who spent a lot of time in New Orleans and in that area of the country, he was very familiar with these types of graves and this type of a cemetery. So I can imagine that in a weird way, he was very comfortable with this scene. But how cool is that? Sunset, Mallory Square, sunrise, Key West Cemetery. Welcome to Key West, Jimmy Buffett. All right, so Jimmy Buffett had come down here to Key West, Florida, and got his first taste of the island that would become his home. So, Jimmy knew that he wanted to move down here to Key West. And after he finished his commitment to the Flick up there in Miami, he came back down here. Now, those first few weeks and months, he didn't have a whole lot of places to stay. He was staying with his buddy Tom Corcoran, who was the bartender at the chart room, and also the very, very famous writer, Tom McGuane. And Tom McGuane owned this property right here at 123-125 Ann Street. And this was kind of like Jimmy's first official residence here in Key West. Now, he didn't stay here in the main property, which is now a dive center. He stayed, I'll show you, back over here in one of the guest houses, guest compound, back over there. Now, Remember from the first videos that I did, the first vlogs, when you see that no trespassing sign, you know you are on to something good. So we can't take any more steps forward. I'm here on the sidewalk. But back there is where Jimmy first stayed when he came down here on Tom McGuane's property. Now, allegedly, from what I have read, Jimmy was having too good of a time while he was staying here. And Tom McGuane's brother was also staying here at the time. So it was suggested to Jimmy that perhaps he find a new location here on the island that he should be staying at. And we're gonna be going to that location. So he checked out of here, first official residence of Jimmy Buffett here in Key West. And we're gonna go on to the second one right now. 123, 125 Ann Street, former home, Tom McGuane and Jimmy Buffett. Quick little fun fact about this location. So as I mentioned, Tom McGuane, that he owned this property. It was while he was living here that he wrote most of his very critically acclaimed novel, The Bushwhacked Piano, right here. Later to be Jimmy Buffett's first home in Key West. So behind me here is 1011 Von Phister Street. And this is the property that Jimmy moved to after he left Ann Street, 123 Ann Street. So as I mentioned to you, it was kind of suggested that Jimmy move on, that Tom McGuane's brother, who was also living at 123 Ann Street, thought that Jimmy could probably move to a different location. We'll put it that way. So Tom McGuane also owned this property as well too. And Tom McGuane lived here with his wife Becky. And it was while Tom McGuane was living here that he finished the book, The Bushwhacked Piano, and wrote the majority of what will become his greatest novel, his masterpiece, many people would say, 92 in the Shade. He wrote that while he was living here. So Jimmy moves in here after 123. Now, here's the interesting thing about this property, and bear with me on this one. So, Tom McGuane finishes 92 in the Shade, and it's not a huge commercial success, but it's a huge critical success. And that leads to the eventual development of a movie, a major motion picture, 92 in the Shade. So, 92 in the Shade is going to be made into a movie, and it's going to be filmed down here in Key West. Tom McGuane, who had no experience directing movies, was actually the one that was chosen to be the director of this film, first-time director. So he's going to be directing 92 in the Shade. Some of the stars of that movie, a lot of big stars are in that movie, but for the purpose of this video, pay attention here. So Margot Kidder, yes, Margot Kidder of Superman Lois Lane fame is one of the stars of 92 in the Shade, along with Peter Fonda, who was just coming off his big success of Easy Rider. He was an Easy Rider, and of course he's a member of the Fonda legacy, Hollywood royalty. So Peter Fonda, Margot Kidder are in that movie. So they're all down here filming that movie. Tom McGuane begins a relationship with Margot Kidder. At the same time, Becky McGuane, Tom McGuane's wife, begins a relationship with Peter Fonda. So Tom and Becky were living here. Eventually, Peter Fonda marries Becky McGuane and purchases this property. So Tom and Margot Kidder moved from this property. Eventually, Margot Kidder and Tom McGuane split. And then Tom McGuane meets and eventually marries Mallory Buffett, Jimmy Buffett's little sister. The 70s were crazy down here. So this is all detailed in the book, Mile Marker Zero in the Movable Feast of Key West. But this property right here, Tom McGuane, Jimmy Buffett, they lived here. 1011 Von Phister. Okay, we are back now at probably the most famous residence that Jimmy Buffett had down here in Key West, Florida. 704 Waddell Street. So Jimmy had been staying at Tom Corcoran's place, Ann Street, Von Phister. Eventually he got an apartment here at 704 Waddell in the early 1970s. And this would become his residence here on the island for the next few years. And it's not just the location where he is at, I'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's the albums that came out while he was living here. You had probably the two greatest Jimmy Buffett albums of all time were made while he was living here. And you can't help but think that he was inspired to write many of those songs by this time living here. A1A and Havana Daydreamin, my two most personal favorite albums. And it was just on the other side of here that he was sitting in that lounge chair drinking that Michelob, which is the cover of the A1A album. Also, can you picture him on the other side of here with the ocean behind him and being inspired to write Trying to Reason with Hurricane Season? And he stumbled next door to the bar, and that bar next door is Louie's backyard. And we will be going over there in a second. But this is where Jimmy lived in the mid-70s. Now, he had a second floor apartment here. And on the first floor was his good friend, Chris Robinson. Chris Robinson still is a resident of the Florida Keys and shows up from time to time quite a bit still in Key West. He's very distinct looking with his mustache. But there used to be a door. The door now is right here. There used to be a door here that would lead you up to the apartment. But this was Jimmy Buffett's home in the 1970s. And so much of that music that we have loved and lived was created while he was living here. This is now the Coconut Beach Resort. And there are timeshares here, and you can stay here for a weekend. It's quite expensive, but it's very nice. You can get a timeshare here. But how many of the people do you think that stay here have no idea about Jimmy Buffett once lived here for years and was inspired to write so many songs that they probably know every single word to? So Jimmy was living here in the mid-70s. He also had a home in Aspen, Colorado at this time as well too. And he spent quite a bit of time not only on the road, but at his Aspen property as well. So he allowed the writer Hunter S Thompson to live here in the mid to late 70s. Hunter S Thompson was a truly unique character. He was extremely talented, extremely troubled, and his stories are incredibly interesting. I've said this before, but if you read the book, Mile Marker Zero and the Movable Feast of Key West, it details Jimmy Buffett and that entire orbit of artists that were down here at that time, the writers, the singers, etc., that were down here. And Hunter S. Thompson was no exception. So Jimmy eventually got rid of this apartment when Hunter S. Thompson was running up crazy, monstrous phone bills, and Jimmy just said, enough. So that was the end of Jimmy Buffett at this location. But you can come down here and visit this. I highly encourage you go next door to the bar, Louie's backyard. Try not to stumble. And I'm going to show you now the view that you have from Jimmy Buffett's former backyard to Louie's backyard. 704 Waddell, probably the #1 Jimmy Buffett residence here in Key West. So behind me would have been Jimmy Buffett's backyard right over here. And over there with the blue umbrellas, that is Louie's backyard, the restaurant. So when Jimmy said that he stumbled next door to the bar, he could stumble out of his back door and right into Louie's backyard right there. Close proximity. This is also the water in the scene that would have inspired Trying to Reason with Hurricane Season. He would have been looking out at this exact same view that you're seeing right here. Again, that photo from A1A cover, which he has stated was shot in his backyard, would have been taken right over there, him sitting there holding a Heineken, looking out at the water. Trying to Reason with Hurricane Season. From Jimmy Buffett's backyard to Louie's backyard down here on Waddell Street. So by the mid-1990s, Jimmy had reconciled with Jane, and they were looking for a more stable environment with which to raise their children and their family. And so Jimmy needed to get out of the apartment lifestyle living that he had been doing in the old town section of Key West. And in the 1990s, they bought a house over here on Sunrise Drive, and it is on the canal, and it provided Jimmy with open access to the water, which he loved. Also in a kind of secluded area that was away from the craziness that is Old Town Key West. And this was Jimmy's last official residence here in Key West. And Jimmy was just becoming too big of a fish in a small pond. And he had reached the point in his life where the commercial success was really taking off. The Margaritaville brand was becoming world known, just incredibly popular. And with his newfound focus on family and looking to restore a little bit of sanity and getting his businesses together, Key West no longer made sense for him. So Jimmy always appreciates and talks so openly and caringly about these days that he spent down here. And by doing this video that we've been able to do and take you through all the different locations where Jimmy Buffett lived in Key West and how he got his start, and the small little homes that he started out in, the crash pads, and built himself up to become the major superstar he is today. We can't fault Jimmy for looking to move on to a new phase of his life. He should be celebrated for bringing the positive attention that he did to Key West. And let's think about it. The songs that he wrote was a time capsule to what Key West was like in the 70s and into the 80s. And by being able to still come back and visit some of these sites, 3628 Sunrise Drive, 3624, that house was not here when he lived here, but he did own this property. We can see a glimpse of what it was like in the 70s and the 80s when Jimmy Buffett was writing these great songs that we all know by heart and we love. And that's going to do it for this episode of All the Stories That I Can Tell. Thank you again for watching. Hit that subscribe, hit the notification, hit the like, and leave me your comments. I love reading the comments, especially those folks that lived down here at the time in the 70s and the 80s when Jimmy was down here writing these terrific songs that we all love. So please continue to do that, and I am going to have more Jimmy Buffett related vlogs coming in the future. So again, thank you all very much. I'll see you soon. Fins up.